As many of you, excuse me, I have to cough. As many of you will remember, a few years ago, we had at the Harn this wonderful exhibit, Congo Across the Waters. And Susan Cooksey, our speaker today, was the curator and the editor of the marvelous book that came out of that, co-editor with Robin Pointer, who was the first speaker in our series. And I therefore think Susan really doesn't need an introduction. Like Christopher Wren, you had only to look around and see what she had done. And she is a multiple degree holder from the University of Florida. She originally set out to be a painter and was converted to art history, and especially to African art, by Robin Pointer. And she has devoted herself in many wonderful ways to making the Harn and Gainesville a wonderful place to live. So I'm not going to say any more. I just want you to hear her.
Well, that was more than generous, Richard, and thank you so much. And I think you and many people here at OCAMIC probably make Gainesville a wonderful place to live also. And certainly OCAMIC seems wonderful to me. So I'm very happy to be back here. I've spoken here a few times, but I'm happy to come back and revisit Congo Across the Waters and talk to you today about it. It's been a while. It closed in 2015 after touring the US. So I was so glad that so many people in the country got to see it. So anyway, I had to revisit this material after many years and really focus. So I hope this topic is of interest to you. I'm going to be hiding back here a little bit, even though I like to be out and gesturing, but I'm going to try and focus on the talk. And
to see you right there.
Okay, so I'll be over here. All right. This talk is titled Congo in America, Art and Memory, Art as Memory and Medicine. Memory is who we are. Knowing our personal history and our collective histories are essential to our identity and well-being. Today, I'm going to talk about the role of art and memory in the lives of a group of people, the Congo, who came to this country from Africa, and how that made them and us what we are. The contributions of Africans to American art and culture came from an enormous diversity of peoples across Africa, and the influence of one group, the Congo people of West Central Africa, was profound. The significant impact of Congo art and culture is such that it is still visible and still vital in America today. It has endured for over 500 years. Between 1500 and 1900, some 8 million enslaved Africans were transported across the Atlantic to the Americas. About half of them, 4 million or so, were from West Central Africa, and while most were brought to Brazil and the Caribbean, as you see on the map here, this large, very thick arrow going toward Brazil, it's likely that around 90,000 were sent to the United States. The largest group of West Central Africans were forced to work on plantations in South Carolina, but there were also significant populations in the Southeast and the Northeast of the US. And here I just have a few statistics. The Africans transported to America from 1500 to 1900, there were about almost 400,000 Africans to mainland North America directly from Africa, and even more came from the West Indies. So 92,000 plus were of West Central African origin, and other Congo and West Central Africans transported just between 1628 and 1858. There were 60,000 plus that went to South Carolina and Georgia, and then others to the Gulf states, to the northern US, and to the Chesapeake area. Who were the Bakongo, and why did they have such an important influence? And what specifically can we see in American life today that reflects their art and culture? The map that you're looking at has a darker area that covers part of what is the modern state of Democratic Republic of Congo and Angola. And you will see right above the green lettering that says Congo in the bottom part, it says Mbanza Congo, South Salvador. And I realize that's very small print, but that's the capital of the Congo Kingdom, which started possibly as far back as 13th century. Kikongo, the language of the Congo, is highlighted up here in this paler brown or grayish brown region. And this shows the sphere of influence of the Congo Kingdom to a much broader area in the Republic of Congo, Gabon, Cabinda, and another part of Democratic Republic of Congo. So you see, it was a huge kingdom covering a huge area, and its cultural and religious and other influences and political and military influence was quite widespread. The Congo had a strong centralized kingdom. As I said, it had a wide artistic, cultural, political, and military influence. But the origins of the kingdom can be traced through both archaeological evidence, some possibly as old as the 13th century, as I noted. In oral histories, the first king of Congo, who was called the Mani Congo, was a culture hero whose skills of blacksmithing were associated with harnessing supernatural powers and enhancing civilization. Both are critical to understanding the enduring power of Congo cultural institutions and artistic production. Mbanza Congo was an impressive place for Europeans who visited, and we see two images created by European artists. One is this engraving published by Olfert Dapper in 1668. He was a geographer, historian, and many other things. And the other on the right is by Beza Dasti, and it pictures a dance performed before a missionary and in front of what looks like a church. And you see the man kneeling in the front is the Mani Congo himself in this opulent red robe and shield and sword. And note the swords that are carried and being wielded in this dance called the Sangamento, which honors not only the king, but it honors the ancestors. And remember the blacksmithing history I mentioned, these are iron swords. So iron was of a particular importance to the Congo Kingdom. Now, by the time these images were published, Europeans were starting to aggravate, I guess you could say, the Congo Kingdom. And there was a war that broke out between the Portuguese and the Congo Kingdom. And it left it decentralized, and yet the memory of the Congo Kingdom lives on, and the capital, Mbanza Congo, has remained an important religious and cultural center for peoples in the Congo today. Now, I have to note that Europeans first encountered the Congo court in 1482. The Portuguese came, and in 1491, the King of Congo adopted Christianity. So Congo became the first Catholic African state on the continent. And from that point onward, Christian symbolism appeared in Congo arts, but Congo beliefs persisted even so. So there was a layering of Christian iconography and Congo iconography in the arts from henceforth. So that is something to bear in mind. Congo people had an unshakable belief in the strong connection between the physical and spiritual worlds that allowed for the regeneration of human life in a cycle of birth, life, death, and afterlife in the spirit world, and then rebirth. Almost every art form of the Congo pivots around these fundamental concepts. These are the ideas that informed, nourished, and were remembered for hundreds of years. They took root in the communities of Congos and other African peoples across the Atlantic Ocean as well, where they were refashioned and reimagined continually. But even as they were reinterpreted by many peoples, they remain as identifiably Congo. These ideas are elegantly visualized in an ideographic form seen here called a Dikinga that can be identified in artworks by Congo peoples and their descendants in America. Seen in its elaborated form, as you see here, and there's some that are even more complex, it is sometimes referred to as a cosmogram, a term coined by an American scholar, and it is seen in two concentric circles transected by vertical and horizontal axes aligned on cardinal directions. The cardinal points indicated by small circles at the ends of the axes mark key points of the life cycle for humans and all things in the world. They also correspond to 4 moments of the sun's celestial movements: sunrise, noon, sunset, and midnight. The point of birth, as you see over here on the right, is marked by a black circle. The midpoint of life, or the zenith of life and maturity, is marked by a red circle. The moment of death is marked by a white circle over here on the left. And life as an ancestral spirit is marked by a yellow circle. So that would regenerate, and the circle keeps going. The movement of life goes and keeps going round and round. So there is rebirth. The horizontal axis is called Kalunga, and it represents the permeable but invisible boundary between the physical world at the top half of the circle and the spirit world on the bottom half of the circle. The spirits are thought to dwell in a world that is like the sea, and thus the Kalunga line is often imagined as the surface of the water. The vertical axis is called Mukula, and it's the conduit between the living and the deceased in the spirit world. Mukula is associated with the growth and seeking of knowledge of the principles of life as taught by the ancestors in the spirit realm. The Dikinga teaches that humans can and must communicate with the ancestors in the spirit world who have the wisdom and power to enable well-being on earth. Major life passages, including birth, initiations into adulthood, death, coronations, and healing ceremonies, and any major life decisions are times when the ancestors must be consulted. The abstracted visual themes of this belief system that have persisted over the ages are the circle, cross, or the simple cross motif, the colors of the living and the dead, particularly white, which is called impemba, and the shining surfaces like light flashing on the surface of water are symbolic of the Kalunga line as the point of contact with the spirit world. In sacred rituals, a Dikinga would be drawn on the ground by the priest, who is called a Nganga, creating a sanctified space that invoked the presence and help of the ancestors. The cross motif is an ancient Congo symbol, and you see it's an equal armed cross, unlike the Christian cross. And we see here on the left a petroglyph found in a cave in Lower Congo, which has been dated tentatively between the 16th and the 19th century. However, other petroglyphs have cross-like forms and figures that date possibly to the 13th century. So archaeologists are thinking that this is the possible origin of the Congo Kingdom. The abstracted, I've already said that, I'm sorry. So I wanted to show you another image here on the right, which is the finial of the hilt of the sword of honor. Now, the sword of honor is one of the swords that was in the watercolor I showed you from 1740 that were being wielded before the king and the missionary. Those were the elite members of the Congo court that were given these swords by the king, and they waved them around to show their tribute to the king, their homage to the king, and to their ancestors, and particularly to their blacksmith ancestors, that they had to be very well versed in blacksmithing and knowledge of the art of blacksmithing and the history of blacksmithing, and one of them could become king himself. So these swords played a very important role, and they're iron swords, but they're anthropomorphized forms on the hilt. If you look at the top, you see what looked like a face with eyes, these big eyes. And if you notice one side of the hilt, the arm, it's like an arm that goes up, and it has a finial of a cross, a Congo cross, and one goes down. Well, what is that about? The arm going up is a symbol of the world of the living, the physical world, just as the Dakinga shows us. And the arm going down is, of course, pointing to the realm of the ancestors. So both have to be acknowledged by all peoples in the Congo world. They have to be cognizant of both, and they have to move between both and respect both worlds. So this is what this sword is saying, which dates from the 17th century, but this form is seen in petroglyphs, which goes back much earlier. So we know that this is a very early kind of anthropomorphized cross-like motif. The Dakinga also appears in many other abstracted forms. As I said, a simple cross, but it also is a circle with a cross in the center, a diamond or lozenge shape, a quartered diamond, a spiral, and a four-tiered pyramid. And as you see here, it is incorporated into the beautifully woven motifs on this basket on the left and into this woven mat on the right, a very complex form on this funerary mat. So these would have been baskets probably made by men of bark or wood liners that were covered with this beautiful twill work and raffia and other fibers. And the mat would have also been woven by men, very large, probably 4 by 6 foot mat. Capturing the powers of the spiritual and physical world is made visible in objects aimed at enforcing justice and in protecting and healing. And these objects are called Cooksey, which are sometimes referred to in the literature of the Western world as power objects, but more accurately, Cooksey are personalized medicines. They are composed of arrays of carefully selected objects of plant, animal, or mineral matter that can be bundled together, contained in bottles, baskets, pots, horns, shells, or any type of vessel. Or these medicines can be attached to or embedded in figural forms, as you see here on the left, which are either anthropomorphic or zoomorphic sculptures. And one of the most visually striking Cooksey forms are called Cooksey Nkandi, which is typically a human or animal figure covered with metal blades, such as nails, knives, and other substances as well, vegetal or mineral substances, animal parts and pieces. The purpose of an Cooksey is to draw upon the forces of the spirit world as an intercessor to solve a person's problem. But some Cooksey are fighters for law and order, as is true of this one on the left, which is a formidable male figure called Mangaka that was charged with settling and enforcing trade agreements in the Chilongo River in the last half of the 19th century. So there were great trade disputes going on with Europeans coming in, and somebody had to be there to say, this is the right way this transaction should go. So they called in mangaka. So there were a lot of these mangaka Cooksey made, and they're quite tall. They're almost 3 feet tall. So they're formidable looking creatures. The Nganga knows which substances or medicines can be most effective to solve his client's problem and gathers them to create the Cooksey. The result is a kind of visual poetry that reflects the Congo worldview so elegantly expressed in the Dakinga. For example, the mangaka in Cooksey has large staring white eyes, showing he can see into the spirit realm. Remember, the spirit realms are represented by white. And other Cooksey may have bright reflective eyes made of pieces of mirror or glass that flash like light on water so that they can envision and evoke the spirits to emerge from their watery realm. Sacred medicines buried in the cylindrical protrusion on the abdomen, which you see is covered with this large shell, empower the figure further. And this too is capped by often either a white or reflective substance. And here it's the white shell and white pigment. Some figural in Cooksey may be draped or covered with small containers, such as animal and plant matter, but this dramatic type of Cooksey, the Nkandi, has hundreds of iron nails and blades that were inserted in the surface to activate the figure. So they were driven into this figure by the Nganga to make it work. And he would summon the spirit to come and make this work, to seek a solution for the client. When the problem was solved, the figure could be decommissioned. And certainly this in Cooksey, the mangaka, is aggressive and demands results. I mean, he just looks at you and says, I want something to happen. But if Cooksey never seems to work to solve the problem, it's discarded as an ineffectual thing. Many non-figural Cooksey, such as the basket that you see here on the right, protect or heal or solve other problems. This basket in Cooksey is a collaboration of a fiber artist who makes the elaborate lidded basket that has triangles on it representing leopard spots, which alludes to the leopard as a symbol of royal authority. The natural substances gathered within it include seed pods, shells, nuts, stones, and feathers. So quite different from the other Cooksey, and visually and otherwise. How were Congo beliefs and aesthetics manifested in the earliest days in America? It is more and more obvious that Congo people in America recreated their traditional objects and practices whenever they could, but they could be punished for practicing their religion, and they could be punished for asserting their identity in any way. So they had to work in secret, creating objects and performing their rituals without the gaze of the master upon them. They honored ancestors and called upon them in times of need to heal illness and injury and help them survive in general. To honor their dead and assure safe passage to the other world was very important to them. For them, the medicines they used from memory were a way of maintaining their legacy and their identity. The Congo and Ganga committed the powers of the materials in the environment used in the Cooksey to his memory. But in America, were there Nganga? Was there enough knowledge between the Congo enslaved communities to recreate the Nganga's effective medicines? Was it merged with beliefs of others, such as Native Americans, Europeans, and other African groups? Did other people from across Africa and America borrow from the pervasive and powerful Congo knowledges of channeling the spiritual world and the arts and practices that supported them? Probably all of these were true. Memory for enslaved people was crucial for well-being and for survival. Memory was medicine, and medicine was memory. In early America, we do see objects related to Cooksey, including bundles, containers such as ceramic pots, and assemblages of objects referred to as caches, placed in secret places in dwellings or workspaces. The conjurer's cache that you see here on the right was found in the Charles Carroll house in Annapolis, Maryland, it was installed probably sometime between 1790 and 1800. It was placed 18 inches under the dirt floor of a room in the house, which was built in 1732 in Annapolis, and the assemblage was probably made by an enslaved African woman, possibly a woman named Mary, who lived in that room. The Carroll family, including Charles Carroll, who was the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence and the first Attorney General of Maryland, who built this house, owned over 1,000 slaves. So over the course of the Carroll family's time in that house, they had 1,000 enslaved people going in and out of the house. So as I said, this cache was discovered under the floor of a enslaved woman's room, and it was found by archaeologists in 1990s. The cache was placed beneath a white bowl, and you see the fragment of this bowl up in the upper part of the slide on the right, and it has a blue asterisk on the bottom. So that was inverted over all these other objects. It includes rock crystals, white bone buttons, a smooth black pebble, 2 coins, and straight pins. The white porcelain and bones suggest the land of the ancestors. The crystals, the invocation of the spirits, pins compared to the blades and the Cooksey and the asterisk and buttons with 4 holes may have been seen as cosmogram images and served as a means of activation for the spirit energies. The cache functioned, as in Cooksey, probably to protect the inhabitants from malevolent spirits. That's a conjecture, we don't really know. Now this assemblage, also from Annapolis, was found in the house of James Bryce, who was the governor of Maryland in 1792. The house was built in 1767 to 1773. And this is but one of the caches that archaeologists had found in the house recently, and it was placed beneath the floor of a kitchen, and it was in a configuration of clusters that were in a north, south, east, west quadrants. And you see that there were 2 hearths delimiting the space of this region where this diagram is. It's kind of this ellipse in the middle, and there's a hearth on what would have been, I think, the north side and the south side. We showed this in the exhibition Congo Across the Waters, and I remember creating this big ellipse on a pedestal that is a Dekinga-like ellipse, and I marked it out, and I carefully had to put all the ingredients of this very large cache, which had been installed over many years, and probably by separate people over the years. But what was in it? There were porcelain doll parts in the north. Feathers were found in the south. The east had a pierced coin. And later, shells, buttons, matches, and a Civil War button, a holster boss, and glass buttons, beads, scraps of fabric, a root ball, a shiny black stone or 2, and 19th century coins, as well as fish scales, and a small gold hoop fragment were found. So again, we see references to water and to the realm of ancestral spirits. We see shiny objects invoking spirit presence and action, and much, much more that could be apotropaic or healing. The basic motif of the cosmogram inscribed on ceramic wares is the most ubiquitous evidence we have of Congo presence in early America. Dean Hall Plantation in South Carolina was built in the 18th century on the Cooper River and had more of these fragments than any other site that's been found so far in North America. The plantation was home to hundreds of enslaved individuals over time, and many of which we can assume were from West Central Africa, since over 40% of the enslaved Africans in the Charleston area were from West Central Africa. There were 3 kiln sites on the property, all run by the enslaved Africans, and up to 59,000 potsherds were found, with over 1,000 of them decorated, and of these, there were 27 types of the cross pattern inscribed on them. With the cross pattern inscribed on them. So many cross inscribed vessels have been found in riverbeds in South Carolina estuaries, and they're usually near rice plantations where enslaved Africans would have been working. And apparently they were cast into the river as ceramic whole vessels that were cast into the river. And it's likely they were offerings to ancestors who dwelled beneath the waters, perhaps to heal and protect or to commemorate a deceased loved one, for any other reason, perhaps for healing. We don't know, unfortunately. But because slave owners banned African religious practices, even funerals, submerging these sanctified vessels was necessary to hide them. And it was also an act of resistance, a very risky thing to do. Ceramic fragments from the Dean Hall plantation are abundant, but I picked out this one and it was in the exhibition because I was fascinated by the fact that it's kind of hard to see, but there's a double zigzag line going on the shoulder and the neck, kind of near the neck of the pot. And I had a pot from the Royal Museum in Central Africa, which is now the Africa Museum in Belgium, that was 19th century, a beautiful whole pot that had exactly the same motif on it. And you see the motif here in a water pitcher or a pitcher of some kind that has this double zigzag. Well, that is a python motif, and the python is associated with continuity and regeneration. So you see this double zigzag over and over again in Congo iconography. So I wanted to show you the comparison of these motifs. Now, a distinctive ceramic vessel type emerged in the mid-19th century in the Edgefield district of South Carolina. These jugs or pitchers, as you see on the left, have white, big staring eyes, a prominent brow, and a gaping mouth with exposed white teeth. And they combine the Congo-style pitcher I just showed you with the face of an Nkisi. And this is Nkisi Ngaka with these big white staring eyes and open mouth. I think the comparison's pretty clear. A large, heavy brow. So what was happening here? The production of these vessels is linked to 170 enslaved Congo people who were brought to the U.S. illegally in 1858. And among them was a man identified in the records of a local brick-making factory as Romeo, whose Congo name was Taro. And it may be that Taro or other Bakongo created these vessels during their spare moments in the brickworks, drawing on their knowledge of Congo Nkisi or Congo masks or Congo vessels, some of which would have been used on grave sites. And one of those types of vessels is called a Toby jug, imported from England, which has a face. We don't know the purpose of the face vessels, these face vessels here, or what they contain, but they may have been used as grave markers or to deter evil forces in other contexts. And certainly the use of white staring eyes and teeth allude to Pemba, associated with the all-seeing ancestors and their powers to inform and protect the living and fend off evil forces. In one region of the Congo world, artists sculpted steatite images portraying the deceased. And you see one on the left, and they were called Ntadi. And they were meant to portray wealthy and powerful individuals in the community, and they focused on their personal accomplishments and high status. And here we see a figure kind of sitting thoughtfully, and he's wearing a cap that has leopard claws on top, which identifies his rank. And on the right, we see a jolly tippler who is called Toby Philpott, who was a popular fictional character invented in the 18th century in England. And stoneware jugs depicting Toby in various guises were called Toby jugs and were ubiquitous by the 19th century. And in 1830, they were exported to West Central Africa along with Genever bottles containing Holland gin and stoneware pitchers imported from Holland and Germany. The Toby jugs, such as the one that you see in the guise of a soldier here in his red coat and tricorn, became highly sought after in the Congo world. They were prestigious items to own and were placed on the graves of the deceased to honor him. Congo graves were designed to honor the deceased and ease his or her transition to the other world, but at the same time, they were sites for communing with the deceased. Grave displays varied, but one type included an enclosure with a thatched roof, a plinth for display of figural sculptures, as you see here on the left. These are wooden sculptures installed in this shrine, this grave site. and domestic or imported ceramic wares were placed on open grave sites, as you see here on the right, which is absolutely covered with all kinds of crockery. So you might also see white seashells on these graves. So again, it's this white imagery, ceramics or white painted figures or other things, evoking the sense of the ancestor world that the deceased will be passing to. These objects on the right, these ceramic objects, would have been broken so that they were metaphorically had died and would also go to the spirit world where the deceased is growing. But I have a blow up on the bottom corner of this image on the right that it's hard to see, but you can kind of see this little Toby figure with his hat that was on one of these graves. So they were quite popular at the time. African American grave sites, particularly in the southeastern United States, reflect the transmission and transformation of Congo philosophy and aesthetic traditions more clearly than just about any other transatlantic art form. The two images of grave sites that you see here came from Alachua County on the left and center. The grave on the left is bound with exuberant rows of flowers, white edging, and a white cross placed on top facing east in the direction of the rising sun. And it tells us this is sacred space and reminds us of the next life and of a rebirth at the same time. The many white ceramic or sparkling figures on its surface, and you can see that there is a sort of blue, translucent looking dolphin figure, and there are other objects that allude to sea creatures and angels and so forth. That recalls the Congo traditional grave displays of ceramic ware. And it also gives us a sense that this is about the soul's journey and past the watery horizon to the world of the ancestral spirits and back to life again. The Congo world for spiral, Zinga, is associated with the never-ending and repeated movement of the life force, and its focused symmetrical form indicates wholeness, health, equilibrium, and even moral balance. And you see with the conch shell here, which, as you know, as people in Florida, we all know that it has a spiral motif on the top. So not only does it evoke the sea, but it also evokes the continuity of life and the sense of balance in all things and focus. So it's a multivalent kind of image or object or symbol. The grave in the center is covered with white scallop shells and conch shells, and this speaks to the passage of the soul as well. A lot of graves over history have been covered with shells. This is not unique to African American graves. But in Florida, we see an awful lot of graves covered with seashells, and they are African American graves. So they are white, and there's a lot of blue sometimes that you will see. There are a lot of flashing things, moving things. I've seen telephones on graves, little princess phones that you could pick up and call the deceased. I have seen radios. I have seen bottles of all kinds and things that are shiny and glittery, snow globes, solar lights, you name it. It's fascinating. The object on the right is a jar called a memory jar, and you've probably seen these in antique stores or museums. This one came from the High Museum in Atlanta, and it was found in a church in Rome, Georgia, but you can see it's covered with little white figurines, broken tile, seashells, all kinds of memorabilia that would have belonged to the deceased. And so it's a really small encapsulation of what the grave sites would have represented, but it could be carried. Some were in the old days possibly placed on graves. There are many purposes of them. Some were simply kept. Yard displays of objects in the African American world are functional in many ways. They beautify the yard, they mark its boundaries, and they defend the home from evil and honor the deceased. They honor the ancestors. Yard displays link to graves and to Cooksey through their aesthetics and imagery conveyed in coded messages. And for example, on the left, this is Clifton Cofield's yard in Tampa, Florida, which was photographed in 2005. And it had its boundaries defined by yellow arrows painted on the ground and on the sidewalk, pointing into the yard and to the street. And the curb was painted blue as a protective boundary. Now, blue is always used as a way of deterring evil, and you may have seen it on porches and walls of homes for the same purpose. And it's also seen on tombstones and borders around graves, as I just mentioned. Other bold colors seen in Cofield's yard include white, gray, silver, green, bright orange, and red, and those too adorn African American graves. A seated sculpture of a pit bull, which is not in the picture, unfortunately. It's Spuds MacKenzie, you remember from that commercial. It was painted brown and silvery white with bright red accents and faced the street. And it was obviously what is called a watcher figure, one who protects the home from trespassers, whether intruding humans or wayward spirits. Now, often they are lined up in a row, these watcher figures, at the edge of the yard. And I have seen them not far from where I live in Gainesville. They can be stuffed animals. They can be any number of human or animal figures, all kinds of things may be lined up there just watching for these spirits or trespassers. So the unwanted guests are deflected by the silver painted elements, also featured in yard ornaments. And they're evocative of protective spirit actions. So objects that shine or flash, the signal warning that any negative energy will be deflected back to the sender. A painted red and white wagon wheel, which you see here hanging from the tree, recalls the cosmogram. It reminds us that the supernatural cosmic force is at work. Pinwheels and other moving parts, which are also in the yard, but you can't see it here, are conduits. Are serve the same function, and these are also seen in cemeteries. PVC pipes used in yards are conduits of communication to the deceased, whose presence is continuous and always available. So note the proximity of the PVC pipe that you see in the back. There's also a cross back there, which I don't have a picture of, but there is a cross, and it's painted green. But these are symbols of renewal and rebirth. Furniture, elaborate chairs, have been called thrones. And these thrones, which may have tables next to them and other furniture, are usually tipped so that the living people can't sit in them because they're reserved for the deceased. These are reserved for the ancestors. And they are honored by these chairs called thrones. Cofield had a blue and silver painted table with lots of interesting things around it, big panels with butterflies on them and all kinds of painting, and chairs were there, and they were untouched by the living. The William Winston Yard in Virginia that you see here on the right has similar features, but showcases a formal and more symmetrical design that is in a zone for reserved for ancestral presence. So we see these white tree branches framing an altar-like space, which is guarded by watcher animals that are charmingly displayed. The two will look like dogs, and then a rabbit inside this little kind of dog house in the front. They're also strategically placed glass insulators on these tree limbs. They're a little hard to see, but they're from electric poles, and bottles as well on them that catch the light of the sun and capture spirit energy. So again, those are kind of warnings or evocative of spirit present. We have the white suggesting the world of the ancestors. Now, the Congo brought their own style of basketry to the low country region of South Carolina and Georgia, and in their homeland, basket making was a woman's art for domestic baskets mainly, but men also made baskets, and they were usually elaborately adorned for chiefs and the elite, but they made every other types as well. Congo baskets were made with wood, bark, grass, rattan, and raffia palm fibers using varied techniques. But the basic basket technique for fanner baskets used for winnowing grain, as you see here, these large disc-shaped baskets, which are lightly tipped up at the edges, were made with the coil technique. So taking a long bunch of grass and coiling it around and then building it up as a large spiral form. So there's a Congo basket on the left and one on the right from South Carolina. So the South Carolina baskets used bulrushes, sweetgrass. They started introducing pine needles later, and other kinds of materials, palmetto leaves, saw palmetto and palmetto. And men were the makers of these spiral baskets up until the 19th century. So in plantations in South Carolina, originally men were the basket makers. But after the late 19th century, after emancipation, the Penn Center started working with local emancipated individuals who were basket makers, and they passed that on to women eventually. So by the 20th century, women began to take it up, and now it's a major art form. As you know, if anybody's ever been to Charleston, it's just inundated with sweetgrass basket makers, and it's they create baskets of every type imaginable, and they have entered into the fine art market, and many museum collections have these baskets now. Now, the coil technique, which I mentioned, is a spiraling form called the Zynga, and it's also a subtle reminder of the cycle of life as visualized in the Dakinga. So over and over again, you see this repetition of motifs related to this recycling and rebirth and regeneration of life. A more elaborate basket that's been made in the Sea Islands since at least the 19th century is a stepped lid form and nearly identical to those made by Congo basket makers in Africa around the same time. So here on the left, you see an early 20th century Bakongo basket made with coils with a two-tiered step lid, or three, you could say that's three, and it has pretty much the same configuration as the one on the right, which was made by a basket maker in South Carolina named Elizabeth Kinlaw. And here she is on the right sewing a basket in her shop off the road in Mount Pleasant, which I visited in 2012. And you can see the plethora of baskets that she's created around her, some really simple, some very complex. To me, it's all very complex because sewing these baskets is very difficult and takes a lot of skill. But notice that this tiered form on her basket and the one from the Bakongo, hers has 3 tiers. Those tiers correspond to the levels of the Dakinga. Think of the 4 points on the Dakinga. It's a restatement of those 4 points. So it over and over again, we see that idea of regeneration and rebirth coming into all the art forms. And this very important one from South Carolina and Georgia. Now, in America, Congo religious practices and art tradition merge with those of many other peoples, including Africans, Europeans, and Native Americans. These creolized practices emerged throughout the Southeast and in the Caribbean. But in the US, spiritual practices were called root work, conjure, and hoodoo, and all of them are inspired by multiple ideas that come perhaps from Africa and other sources, but there are many that are strongly influenced by the Bakongo ideas that we mentioned today. So voodoo, a religion that spread from Haiti, but it was really called Vodou properly in Haiti, spread to New Orleans as voodoo, and it has now entered Miami as Vodou. But it has Catholic and African roots, and mainly it comes from the religion called Vodun of the Fon people of the Republic of Benin, which used to be Dahomey. But it is also strongly rooted in Congo beliefs and many other African sources. And there's striking visual and conceptual affinities in the objects used in the African Atlantic world, as we can see here. So on the left, we have this very dainty little Congo and Cooksey called a Mbumba Mbondo from the early 20th century, and it's made of a kind of gathering of fabric or raffia cloth that has been bound. It's studded with buttons, brass bosses. It's wrapped in cord, and it has glass beads on the neck, and it has a little feather tuft on top with a stopper. So we don't know what's inside. So what was this little Nkisi for? Well, it was to cause or cure swelling in the body. So that's an interesting point where in Nkisi, you've got to harness those powers just right because they could go either way. So the Nganga knows how to harness for good or bad. And that's what you hear about ritual practitioners all over Africa. I was told in my practice of studying diviners and healers, one of the diviners, amazing woman, said, a diviner is basically the good person who, but she has what you would say a BA degree. But the sorcerers, they can channel the negative spiritual energy. They have the PhDs. I thought that was very astute of her. But the Congo in Cooksey compares very favorably to the one on the far right, which is called a Paquet Congo, and it comes out of Vodou. And this particular Paquet Congo, which is made of kind of a satiny fabric with satin ribbons and thread wrapped around it, it's green, it has a tuft of feathers. It's paired with this bottle that you see on the left of it with a snake, kind of this relief snake wrapped around it, which is a symbol of the fawn deity Dambala. And Dambala made it across the ocean. So he is celebrated by Haitians and other adherents of Vodou in America. So here they are together, and they complement each other's power. So they're seen on altars, and they solve the problem for you together. Now, many contemporary American artists have immersed themselves in Congo art and culture. And two artists, Jose Bedia, a Cuban-American artist, and Radcliffe Bailey, an African-American artist, both examine their personal histories vis-a-vis Congo history and the Congo worldview and religious practices. Cubans who immigrated to the United States brought a Congo-based religion called Palo Monte Mayombe that also employs assemblages of various materials to appeal to supernatural forces for their help in solving problems in our world. These medicines include plant, animal, and human-made materials and are composed in a metal cauldron sometimes, which are called a prenda or nganga. They can be composed in other things as well, but they are the equivalent to an Nkisi. And note that this example on the left rather, is inscribed with a crossroad type of motif painted in white, as well as other designs which are called firmas. And these are essential iconographic images in the practice of Palo Monte Mayombe. The painting on the right by Jose Bedia, who is a Miami-based artist. He was born in Cuba. He was a soldier in the Cuban army in Angola, and where he learned of Congo religion. And he is an initiate of Palo Monte Mayombe, which is pretty much a transposed Congo religion. And many of his works depict his experience as an adherent. The work is called Piango, Piango, Llega Lejos, meaning little by little you will go far. And it concerns the slow and careful progress one makes in learning the esoteric knowledge of Palo Monte Mayombe. And note that the nganga, the pot, the cauldron, contained within the circular body of the central figure. You can see it if you imagine this big circle here, it would be where the sign of birth is on the right, interestingly enough, on the Dakinga. And this is a portrait of the artist himself. He often portrays himself undergoing different phases of his experience in Palo Mayombe worship or experience of some kind. But here he is in the middle of the Kalunga line, you see this wavy white line on the right, and what looks like a turtle with a human head and legs coming up. The Kalunga line, he's crossing across the line of the spirit world into the physical world. He's emerging above it, it looks like. So he's talking about his empowerment, and these little points that you see here, these little white points that look like stars in a constellation, those are called Pwin, and they represent distilled knowledge of Palo Mayombe. So there is distilled points of power. It's a striking image, and it's a very large painting, about, I think it was about 6 or 7 feet in diameter. Now, beginning in the 1990s, the Atlanta-based artist Radcliffe Bailey began his journey to discover his ancestral home in Africa. His quest included the production of a series of works he calls medicine cabinets, 2 of which are seen here. And at the center of each work are photographs of family or friends, some anonymous, unidentified, from long ago that he collected from his family. Other objects of great personal meaning to him are objects associated with collective identities and collective histories of his or other people he knew that have more universal meanings, are placed in these deep shadow box-like constructions. And for example, in the painting By the River on the left, which is from 1997, he includes a photograph of an elegantly dressed woman wearing what looks like a white Victorian dress, and she's flanked with a red gourd, a real red gourd with this long neck, suggesting a medicine gourd, and a seashell, a real seashell built on a little shelf at her feet. The palette includes blue, white, black, red, and yellow, mostly blue and black and white, but a little bit of yellow in there. And we also see nestled beside her a painting of a quartered lozenge, the Dakinga. So you see down on the middle part of the right-hand side, this white diamond form in 4 parts. Well, that's a form of the Dakinga, as we saw in that mat weaving from an earlier slide. And there are also some numbers inscribed above it, and he's plotting out the number of enslaved Africans that were transported to the Americas, and similar figures that I showed you in the first or second slide. The use of blue, the color in sky and water, was seen to divert malicious spirits, as I noted, as well as a reference to the Kalunga and the watery realm of spirits, as seen in the seashell and the gourd, a sign of curing, and the medicine container gourd. And they tell us that this work is about healing and also retrieval of memory. The last of Bailey's medicine cabinets is this painting on the right, and it's called Returnal. Sailing ships like those that transported his forebears from Africa are featured heading to the west. And they seem to be returning from Africa, and they're returning to America. That's what we think. But maybe they're returning also to the land of the living rather than the land of the ancestors. On the right, which is hard to see, but you see a little palmetto frond. This is a real palmetto frond. And behind it is the photograph of a Congo Nkisi, a head of an Nkisi there. In the center is a portrait of a man whose identity the artist didn't know. But his gaze is fixed on us. This is the image of an unknown ancestor, one whose DNA may be shared with the artist. And indeed, he was inscribed, the artist has inscribed the sequence of his own DNA in the upper left-hand corner. And you can't see it, but there's a series of letters up in the very far upper left-hand corner, which finally identified his roots, which came from Sierra Leone and Guinea. The water symbols and the references to continual cyclical movement across the waters and back again are unmistakable nods to the Congo worldview. For Bailey and many other African descent individuals in America, the journey to find one's identity to recall and to recollect memories, and the knowledge of those who have gone before is indeed medicine. Thank you. I wonder if you have any questions or comments. I'd love to hear them. May not be able to answer them.
Speak right into the.
I saw a year ago, a couple of years ago, at the Thomas Center, there was an exhibit by Mr. Eddy. You probably
Oh,
know.
yeah.
So most of his paintings, a lot of them had big teeth, which
Oh, I can move.
when I saw that, the jug from South Carolina with the big teeth, I was just wondering, because I don't really know that much about him except what I read, but if there's any connection at all.
Gosh, I don't think so. But, he was inspired by so many sources. He has big hands, but they do look like those in Cooksey, don't they? Maybe they were.
I was just wondering.
He's not African American, or he wasn't. But he was inspired by who knows what, his own imagination primarily. But he looked at art history books a lot. As you know, he did the Mona Lisa, and he did a Van Gogh portrait in his own style and things like that. So he was all over the map. But yeah, those are like in Cooksey, come to think of it. Yeah, it's interesting.
Well, thank you. It was very interesting.
Well,
Okay, we have a question here on Zoom. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, so you're speculating on meaning in Bailey Radcliffe's works. And I'm just wondering if if he's still alive, one could inquire of his meaning instead of speculating, or maybe the artist wants us to speculate. I'm always interested in the interpretation of art or music, and sometimes the artist says, we'll turn the question back on you. What do you think? And what does that represent? But I'm wondering if you were able to talk to Bailey Radcliffe about his works.
He did come to see the exhibition, and we had a big panel, and he did talk about it. There was a wonderful catalog that the High Museum put together. It was called Memory as Medicine, and it was all his work. And we purchased the last in the series. I should have said that Returnal was the last in that series because he had found his identity. He had done his DNA. He knew where he was from. He was from Sierra Leone and Guinea, and he had forebears in North Carolina. The paint that he used was mixed with soil from his ancestors who had lived in North Carolina, were farmers, who were the tobacco farmers. So he had ground tobacco and soil in that brown part of the painting. And he was deeply committed to understanding more about his heritage. But a lot of what I said came from the book that was written by the Harn curator, and frankly, not so much from conversations with him, but I know the curator spent a lot of time, Carol Thompson spent a lot of time writing that book and hanging out with Radcliffe, Bailey. And so she's the one that encouraged us to put it in the exhibition about Congo because it is so deeply rooted in Congo. There are a lot of other African influences you can see in it. But I agree, I think it's good to throw in whatever we know the artist says about their intentions, but artists are sort of slippery about intention. Yeah. And if they, I always felt like if you could vocalize and articulate your intention verbally, why would you do an artwork? Because it says so much more that you yourself don't even know. And it opens it up to everyone join the conversation. That's what art's good at. So I was sort of joining the conversation.
Let me add two more things that are interesting. One is that at the Cotton Club Museum now, we have an exhibit of Gullah and Geechee culture, including some amazing baskets and other artifacts, both from Africa and South and the coastal islands of South Carolina and Georgia. So I encourage people to visit. It's a great exhibit. It's the museum is open from 11 to 4 on Wednesday, Thursday, and Saturday through December. The exhibit will be there. And also I received my Smithsonian magazine today, and there's a whole article I haven't read yet on reviving the growing of indigo in Georgia. Excuse the dogs. The indigo color, I think, is very dominant in the artworks too. So there may be a connection there as well. I haven't read the article, so I don't know the origin of indigo originally and how it was grown back in the 18th, 19th century.
Well, we had a lot of indigo plantations in Florida. I know there was one across the Intercoastal Waterway near Volano Beach, and there's a guano preserve there. There was a huge indigo plantation, and it was a favorite crop along with cotton and other things. But yeah, indigo is the color, and I never thought of that. So thank you. It is important. That beautiful blue that you can't reproduce any other way. And it is dying out in Africa too. You know, they have so many synthetic indigos that artists are starting to bring it back. And
Okay, thank you. We have another question here in the Oak Room.
Hello, Susan. It was so good to see you. And,
oh, Ed, hi.
and to make
back there.
You mentioned the Catholicism, our traditional religions, and my thought immediately went to voodoo, because it's different than Catholicism, and in some way maybe be considered pagan, because it's not Christ, it's not God, et cetera, but it's part of the culture of the Haitians, the people from Africa, et cetera, et cetera. Is there some kind of reconciliation among the Haitian, among the Africans, when they practice voodoo and also recognize the Catholic religion and other American traditional religions?
That's a good question. I don't know about Africans getting involved with Haitian voodoo, but I think people who have studied it intensely could tell you more about it. I have not studied it intensely, but there are a lot of people around here. There was an institute of voodoo, here for a while. I don't know what's going on now. And I'm sure that there is some interaction, because there's interaction with a lot of other religions. There are people who do masking, say, in Cuba or other islands in the Caribbean that go to Africa, and people from Africa come here or to this part of the world, and they borrow from each other. They celebrate together. So I don't know. That's a good question, though. I'm sure there's a lot that has gone on over the years and centuries, and it's probably still happening.
Well, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. And before we go, I want to remind you that normally these ILR courses are 6 lectures, but this course is 7 lectures. And next Tuesday, we have Alwyn Sao, who is a Nigerian scholar who is in the English department at UF, who will be talking about an overview of Anglophone African writers. And I think that'll be an interesting way to close the whole project. So thank you all for coming, and come back next week.